There's a sound the world makes before dawn, not birdsong, not wind, something older than that, a hum, a vibration felt more in the chest than heard by the ear, the sound of millions of lives stirring before the heat rises, before the day demands its toll. In the sprawling outskirts of Lagos, in the river towns of Bangladesh, in the plateau villages of Bolivia, and the dust-choked corridors of Nairobi, this sound begins the same way. A mother lighting a flame, a child wrapping cloth around tired feet, a man walking 4 miles to stand in a queue that may or may not move by midday. The sun does not discriminate. It rises on all of them, the rich city and the broken village alike. But what that light falls upon, that is where the story begins. You have heard the phrase before, developing countries. The word carries within it a quiet promise that development is in motion, that progress is accumulating, that somewhere beyond the horizon, prosperity waits like a tide preparing to rise. But what if the tide was designed never to reach certain shores? What if the wall between poverty and abundance was not built of stone or fire, but of systems, invisible and ancient, coded into the very architecture of how the modern world was assembled? This is not a story about laziness. It is not a story about culture or fate or the mysterious will of geography. It is a story about structure, about the machinery that governs nations, and about how that machinery was built, deliberately, consequentially, to serve some and to contain others. Listen carefully, because the wall is not where most people think it is. The world before the wall had a name. To understand why some nations cannot rise, you must first understand the world they were born into and what was taken from them before they were allowed to call it their own. In the year 1500, there was no such thing as a developing country. The term had not been invented, because the gap it describes had not yet fully opened. The civilizations of West Africa commanded long-distance trade routes that made European merchants tremble with envy. The Mughal Empire of South Asia produced nearly a quarter of the entire world's economic output. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was larger, cleaner, and more organized than any city in Europe at the time. China's Silk Roads carried wealth and volumes the Western world had not yet imagined. The world was unequal. It has always been unequal, but not broken the way it would become. Then came the ships, not explorers in the romantic sense the history books prefer, but armed agents of extraction, sailing under flags of competing empires, carried with them not only cannons and crosses, but a new idea that certain lands and certain peoples existed to be used, that their resources, their gold, their soil, their labor, their bodies, were raw material for someone else's civilization. It began with violence. It always begins with violence. The violence of conquest, of forced conversion, of populations reduced by disease and deliberate massacre. But violence alone cannot build an empire. You need something more durable. You need systems. And so they built them, trade systems that required colonies to export raw materials at controlled prices and import finished goods at inflated ones. Legal systems that protected the property of colonizers and rendered indigenous ownership invisible. Financial systems that flowed wealth upward, always upward, from the periphery to the center. Administrative systems that replaced local governance with distant control, dismantling centuries of indigenous institutions and replacing them with structures designed not to serve the colonized, but to manage them. These systems did not vanish when the colonial flags were lowered. They calcified. They became the inherited skeleton of the modern world, the promise that was never kept. The 20th century offered a great illusion. Wave after wave, decade after decade, the flags came down. India in 1947, Ghana in 1957, Congo in 1960, Algeria in 1962, Mozambique in 1975, Zimbabwe in 1980. Each Independence Day carried the same electric charge. Crowds weeping in city squares, anthems sung for first time in public without fear, the extraordinary sensation of a people reclaiming the right to govern themselves. The world held its breath. Economists sharpened their pencils. Development theory was born, almost overnight, as an academic discipline. There were models, projections, 5-year plans. There was hope of a nearly religious intensity. If colonialism had caused the poverty, and by then, Even the architect of empire could not deny that it had. Then freedom from colonialism would reverse it. The logic seemed unassailable. It was wrong, not because the people were incapable, not because the soil was poor or the climate hostile, but because independence, as it was granted, was a political transformation wearing the costume of an economic one. The laws changed, the leaders changed, the flags changed, but the systems, the deep structural systems that govern how wealth was created, where it flowed, who controlled it, those did not change. They had been running too long to be stopped by a ceremony. Think of it this way. Imagine inheriting a house. But the house has been stripped of its plumbing, its wiring ripped from the walls. The foundation was poor to crack in 50 years. The deed is in your name now, but the bank that holds the mortgage is owned by the man who stripped it, and the interest rate is designed to ensure you never fully pay it down. You are free. The house is yours. And yet, this was a condition that economists, those who bother to look honestly, began to call structural underdevelopment. Not poverty as an accident, not poverty as a failure of effort or intelligence, but poverty as a designed outcome, a product of asymmetries so deep they had become nearly invisible. And into this fragile moment, these new nations, raw with hope and stripped of their institutional inheritance, came the Cold War, two great powers, circling each other across the globe like planets in decaying orbits, and between them, the newly independent world became a theater for their competition. Aid was offered, but with conditions that served the donor more than the recipient. Coups were funded when elected leaders moved too far from acceptable ideological positions. Dictators were sustained with military hardware and diplomatic cover, as long as they kept their borders open to the right kind of commerce. Democracy was not the goal. Stability, which is to say compliance, was the goal. And so the new nations, many of them, did not get the chance to fail on their own terms. They were failed by a system that had never intended for them to succeed. The critical turning point, the debt trap closes. In the 1970s, the trap was set. The oil crisis of 1973 sent shockwaves through global markets. Petrodollars, the enormous profits accumulated by oil-exporting nations, flooded into Western banks faster than those banks could deploy them. And Western banks, under pressure to lend, turned their eyes southward to the developing world, to nations hungry for infrastructure, for industry, for the machinery of modernity they had been denied. The loans were offered at terms that seemed at the time manageable. Interest rates were low. Bankers flew into capitals from Accra to Buenos Aires to Islamabad with briefcases and smiles and the language of partnership. The money moved. Roads were built. Dams were constructed. Governments expanded, hiring civil servants, building hospitals, projecting confidence into the future. Then, in 1979, the United States Federal Reserve raised interest rates. It was a decision made in Washington, D.C., in a building of marble and quiet authority, by men who were thinking about American inflation. They were not thinking about Zambia. They were not thinking about Peru. They were not thinking about the cascading effect their decision would have on nations that had borrowed in dollars and were now being asked to repay those dollars in a currency that had suddenly, catastrophically, become more expensive. Overnight, not literally overnight, but with a speed that felt geological in its violence. The debt burden of developing nations doubled, then tripled. Countries that had borrowed to build found themselves unable to service the interest, let alone the principal. The mathematics had become impossible, not through any failure of governance or ambition, but because a decision made 10,000 miles away had rewritten the equation. And into this moment of crisis walked the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. They came bearing a life raft. But the life raft had a price. Structural adjustment programs. The name alone has the bloodless quality of bureaucratic euphemism, the kind of language that makes catastrophe sound like paperwork. In exchange for emergency loans, nations were required to implement a sweeping set of economic reforms. Cut government spending, privatize state industries, eliminate subsidies on food and fuel, open borders to foreign goods, devalue currencies, reduce trade barriers. The theory was elegant: remove the state from the market, allow prices to find their natural level, and efficiency would follow. Efficiency would attract investment. Investment would generate growth. Growth would reduce poverty. It was a chain of logic that looked beautiful on the whiteboards of economists who had never watched a child die of a preventable disease in a hospital stripped of medicine by a budget cut required by an institution in Washington. In practice, it was a catastrophe of historic proportions. Across sub-Saharan Africa, infant mortality rates rose as health budgets collapsed. Across Latin America, currencies fell and middle classes evaporated. Farmers who had grown food for local markets were suddenly competing with subsidized American grain flooding under the new trade rules. Grain grown with government support that the same institutions now forbade the developing world from providing to its own farmers. Industries that had been carefully nurtured over decades were privatized, often purchased by foreign corporations at prices set by the crisis, and their profits repatriated out of the country. The wealth moved. It always moved. Upward, outward, away from the people who had grown it. Immediate aftermath. The generation that paid. There's a generation alive today that carries this decade in its body. They were born in the 1970s and 1980s, in countries that had entered that period with genuine momentum. Their parents had seen independence. Their grandparents had built something with their hands and their hopes. And then, in the years of their childhood, the world contracted around them. Schools lost teachers. The teachers lost salaries. The salaries had been cut because the IMF had set a ceiling on the government wage bill. Clinics ran out of medicine. The medicine had been cut because health subsidies were a line item on a structural adjustment spreadsheet. Food prices rose. The prices rose because fuel subsidies were eliminated because efficiency demanded it. A child in Ghana in 1983 could feel this in their stomach. Literally. A child in Bolivia in 1985 could feel it in the cold of a house that could not be heated. A child in the Philippines in 1986 could feel it in the silence of a school that no longer had chalk. These are not abstractions. They are lives. They are people who exist today, adults now, grandparents in some cases, who carry within them the specific gravity of what it feels like to be the human cost of a macroeconomic policy that was never designed with them in mind. And here is what makes this story so singular in its darkness. The nations that implemented these policies most faithfully, most completely, most obediently, they fared worst. The nations that resisted, that found ways to protect their farmers and their industries, that defied prescriptions of the financial institutions, South Korea, Taiwan, China, they grew, they industrialized, they built the middle classes that became the pride of the late 20th century. The medicine that was forced on the sick made them sicker. The medicine that was rejected was the medicine that worked. Long-term consequences, the wall in the present tense. The wall did not disappear when the structural adjustment era ended. It evolved. Today it takes different forms. It wears different clothes. But its function is the same, to ensure that the gains of economic activity accumulate at the top of the global hierarchy, and that the effort required to climb that hierarchy grows faster than any single nation's ability to climb it. Consider trade. The global trade system, governed today by the World Trade Organization, was constructed largely by the nations that had already industrialized. Its rules protect intellectual property, which primarily belongs to rich nations. Its rules allow rich nations to subsidize their agriculture, while forbidding developing nations from doing the same. Its rules on services favor the financial systems of London and New York. It is a game whose rules were written by the winners, and which the winners continue to revise in their favor. Consider debt. The developing world today pays more in debt service, interest and principal repayments, to wealthy creditors than it receives in foreign aid. Read that sentence again. The money flowing out of the poorest nations on earth to the richest is greater than the charity flowing in the opposite direction. Aid, which the wealthy world presents as generosity, is overwhelmed many times over by the quiet, structural extraction of debt repayment. Consider the brain drain. The most talented graduates of universities in Nigeria, in Pakistan, in Egypt, in Ethiopia, they are recruited systematically by institutions in North America and Europe. The medical schools of sub-Saharan Africa produce doctors who then leave to work in health systems that can afford to pay them. The engineering departments of South Asian universities produce graduates who fill the technology corridors of Silicon Valley. The human capital that developing nations spent generations building is continuously harvested by the nations that were already rich. Consider the financial architecture itself. When capital moves freely, as the global system now requires, it moves towards stability and return. It flows into the rich world when the rich world offers higher interest rates. It flows out of the poor world in moments of crisis, precisely when the poor world needs it most. The system that was described as liberating, free movement of capital, free trade, open borders for money, is a system that benefits those who have the most capital to move. Consider climate. The nations that industrialized early, the nations that burned coal through their Victorian winters and poured carbon into the atmosphere across their 20th century ascent, have now stabilized their emissions. The nations that are still trying to industrialize, that are still trying to climb the wall, are being told that the ladder they plan to use has been removed, that the fossil fuels that power the rich world's rise are now forbidden to the poor world's present, that they must find another way, one that is more expensive, less proven, and requires technology they cannot yet manufacture themselves. The wall changes shape, but it does not fall. Climax, the moment of reckoning. Here is the thing that history keeps trying to say, and that the comfortable world keeps finding ways not to hear. Poverty is not a natural condition. It is a produced condition. It is produced by systems that were designed, not by malice in all cases, though sometimes by malice, but by interest, by the interest of those who benefit from the current arrangement, by the interest of institutions that were built at a particular moment in history, by particular nations, to serve particular ends. And those ends have not fundamentally changed, even as the language around them has been updated to sound more humane. Development, aid, investment, partnership, growth. These words gleam with benevolence. But trace the money, follow the contracts, read the fine print on the loans, count the patents that must be licensed, the intellectual property that cannot be copied, the trade agreements that open markets in one direction only. And you begin to see, behind the generous language, the same logic that has always been there, that the world is divided between those who set the terms and those who accept them. This is a wall, not a physical structure, not a law that says certain nations cannot prosper, but a web of interlocking systems, trade, debt, finance, intellectual property, climate, migration, each one individually defensible, each one framed in a language of neutrality and rationality, and each one, in aggregate, functioning to preserve the hierarchy that colonialism first established and structural adjustment calcified. And the cruelest part is this: the wall is invisible to those it does not affect. On one side of it, the people who cannot climb look up and see an obstacle. On the other side, the people who have already climbed look back and see nothing. They see only open sky, and they attribute their position to virtue, to industry, to the good fortune of their civilization's choices. They do not see what was done to make the climbing possible for them, and what was done to make it impossible for others. History is not kind enough to be simple. It demands that we look at what actually happened, not what we wished happened, not what the textbooks preferred, but what actually concretely, mechanically happened, and what is still happening now in the commodity markets and the currency exchange floors and the patent offices and the climate negotiating rooms where the future of billions of people is decided by a few hundred. The human cost of architecture. Slow down now. Let the data fall away for a moment. Think about a specific child, not a statistic. A child, let her be 8 years old, in a city in the Sahel, in the year 2024. Her mother works. Her father works. They work the way that people who have no choice work, completely, without complaint, without the luxury of thinking about what they deserve. The family eats. Not always enough, but they eat. The girl goes to school. The school is overcrowded. The textbooks old. The teacher underpaid and exhausted. But she goes. She is bright. The way children are bright before the world teaches them to doubt themselves. She learns quickly. She wants to be an engineer. She has seen a bridge once in a photograph, a vast silver thing over a wide river, and she has decided that she will build bridges. None of what will limit her life has anything to do with her intelligence. None of it has anything to do with her effort, her character, the love her parents pour into her daily existence. What will limit her is the interest rate on her country's debt. What will limit her is the trade policy that prevents her government from investing in the kind of technical education she would need. What will limit her is the brain drain that may take her most talented teachers to institutions in countries that can pay them more. What will limit her is a climate that is already making the Sahel hotter and drier, a climate that her country did almost nothing to create. She is not a victim of her own poverty. She is a casualty of other people's prosperity. This distinction matters. It matters enormously. Because as long as we believe that poverty is a natural result of the choices made by poor people in poor nations, we will continue designing solutions that ask the poor to change and never ask the system to change. We will continue sending aid while protecting the trade rules that make aid necessary. We will continue celebrating debt relief while writing the contracts that make new debt inevitable. We will continue speaking of partnership while maintaining the architectures of extraction. And the girl will grow up and grow old, and the bridges she might have built will remain unbuilt, and the world will be smaller for it. Smaller in ways that cannot be measured in any currency. What the wall reveals about U.S. There's an old question that every generation must answer for itself. What do we owe each other? Not in the abstract, not in the language of philosophy seminars or international summits, but in the concrete, daily, structural sense. What do the systems we build say about what we believe we owe to people we will never meet, who live in places we will never visit, who speak languages we will never learn? The history of the last 5 centuries offers an answer, and the answer, read honestly, is uncomfortable. It says that the systems we built said we owed them very little, that their labor and their land and their resources were available to us, but that the prosperity that labor and land and resources create was not available to them, that we could take, across generations, what we needed, and leave behind not nothing, but something worse than nothing, an infrastructure dependency designed to ensure we could keep taking. But history is not destiny. This is the other thing that careful study of the past reveals, that systems made by human beings can be remade by human beings, that walls built in particular moments to serve particular interests can, when enough people understand what they are looking at, be dismantled, that the architecture of the world is not as permanent as it pretends to be. There have been moments, fleeting, fragile, but real, when the wall has cracked, when debt was genuinely canceled, when trade rules were genuinely reformed, when technology was genuinely transferred, when the voices of the excluded were allowed into the rooms where decisions are made. These moments were always partial, always insufficient, always vulnerable to reversal. But they happen, and they reveal that what exists is not inevitable. What would the world look like if the girl in the Sahel were given what she actually needed? Not charity, not the patronizing generosity of the powerful, but structural justice, a trade system that let her country protect its emerging industries, a debt system that did not extract more than it contributed, a climate framework that made the nations responsible for the crisis pay for its costs, an education system funded by the wealth that her country's resources actually generate, rather than the fraction that remains after the extraction. What would the world look like? Different, richer in ways that money cannot fully capture, richer in the bridges that would be built, the medicines that would be discovered, the music that would be composed, the problems that would be solved by minds that currently spend their brilliance on survival. The wall costs everyone, even those it is built to protect, because a world of deliberate inequality is an unstable world. A world of deliberate exclusion is a world that generates, inevitably, structurally, with the same logic that governs all systems under pressure, migration, conflict, desperation, and eventually the kinds of forces that walls cannot hold back. History has shown this repeatedly. The colonial system collapsed not because the colonizers chose virtue, but because the weight of what they had built became unsustainable. The question is whether the current system waits for that collapse, or whether enough people, in enough places, choose to understand what they are looking at before it comes. The hum before dawn is still there. In Lagos, in Dhaka, in Cochabamba, in Mogadishu, millions of lives stirring before the heat rises. Millions of people carrying within them the weight of systems they did not design, reaching for futures they were never intended to inhabit. They are not waiting to be saved. They are waiting for the wall to stop being built. And that is a decision that belongs not to history, but to us. The most dangerous thing in the world is not a broken system. It is a working one, working exactly as designed, for exactly the people it's designed to serve, while the rest of the world is told the system is neutral. Look at the systems around you. Follow the money. Ask who benefits. And then ask who decided. The answers are not comfortable, but they are available. And in understanding them, truly understanding them, without the comfortable distance of abstraction, there's something that resembles the beginning of change.